I have to say, every time someone says something about crimes being committed in Bitcoin, I just think of the fact that exponentially more crimes are committed with dollars, right? Someone said to me the other day that 2 billion of Bitcoin has been hacked, and then I looked at phishing scams and identity theft. We've lost $600 billion dollars to those kind of hacks over the last year, just dwarfing the problems we see in crypto. Is it really fair to say that this is like one of the big alarming problems of digital assets?
Well, I think we have to separate a couple things. I mean, when I have spoken for years to people who, see the potential in some of the innovation here, it's precisely in greater security concerns that the financial system could ultimately be vulnerable and trying to create something better. That's a separate matter from, is someone going to use the pseudonymity of, say, Bitcoin to be able to get away with things that at least they think they'll get away with. Those are two separate questions. And of course, crypto, Bitcoin especially, is being used in emerging markets, and it depends on whose perspective you have of whether they're evading bad government regulations, bad governments, or they're conducting crime. But I think advanced economies do need to be very concerned about the final use of the pseudonymous cryptos. And I want to draw a world of distinction between, something like Bitcoin and maybe Ethereum, which, has all sorts of further underlying uses.
For sure, but both of them can be tracked on the blockchain. I mean, you make a point of saying pseudonymous instead of anonymous. In fact, when people commit crimes and demand ransom, for example, in digital assets, you can always see where those assets have gone. Whereas if someone just asked for a couple of duffel bags full of $100 bills, they would be off the grid instantly. Doesn't that make it easier to deal with digital crimes?
Well, yes and no. At the moment, it's still pretty expensive to track people. So yes, if you're doing a terrorist action or shutting down the electric grid, it's worth a big investment trying to catch you. But in sort of routine tax evasion, for example, which is what a lot of cash is used for, it's still pretty expensive. Now, you're going to tell me someday it won't be expensive, but then I would say when that day comes, it'll probably undermine a lot of the final demand for certain kinds of cryptocurrencies.
Well, and Ken, obviously we're having this conversation more and more frequently given the sanctions currently in place in regard to Russia because of its invasion of Ukraine. We talk a lot about sanctions evasion, but what we've also heard from our guests like Mike Novogratz of Galaxy Digital is that you are seeing the use case of cryptocurrencies as a lifeline for countries who can't necessarily rely on their own fiat currencies. It's helpful to those people. How is your thinking evolving on that side of the equation, not just when it comes to evasion?
There's no question that it's being used in a lot in emerging markets. Now, I wouldn't say it's such a big deal yet that it's going to supplant the international financial system otherwise in terms of the sanctions on Russia. I just want to echo something your last guest, Michelle, said, which is you need regulation here. Everybody agrees on this. I think when I wrote about this 7 years ago, an area I think I was a little naive was how quickly that might come. And, it feels to me a long ways away, unfortunately, a coherent regulatory structure, and frankly, an international structure, but at least one in the United States.
Well, and there continues to be a conversation in Washington, obviously, on regulation, but also on the idea of a digital dollar. Where do you come down on the need for that when stable coins tied to the U.S. dollar already exist?
A federally controlled digital dollar, right? Because we do already have, the most traded cryptos in the world are digital dollars already.
Indeed. When I listen to central banks talk about the need for a central bank digital currency, I think for a lot of them, at least the big ones, the big central banks, it's actually a sort of a reason to try to tell the public to calm down as they get to regulating it. The central bank digital currencies, as they're imagining them, are clearly not going to be pseudonymous or anonymous for sure. They're going to really be substitutes for very similar things. And yes, it's not at all clear that stable coins wouldn't offer a more diverse and better range of things for the consumer if they're properly regulated. So it's sort of a little bit of a red herring, the central bank digital currency. Yes, it's coming, but I think we've already seen in China, it's come and doesn't do much. Of course, in China, they can tell people to use things. They can't do that in the United States or most advanced economies.
I think, we've heard so many people talk about a threat to the U.S. dollar, and you just said you don't think this is going to be a threat to, the world reserve currency now. But I wonder if you can look at what's happened with Russia. They thought financial resources spread around the world, and then one government or a group of governments just turns that off, which has to make them want to look for, and probably other countries and people as well, an alternative form of currency, right? At some point, do we look back and say this could have been the beginning of the end of the dollar as a world reserve currency?
Well, that's a little bit hyperbolic, but it could be true, a long time from now. China and Russia have been looking for an alternative to the dollar for a very long time, and there are just these huge network effects, not to mention that in China, the rule of law isn't what it is in the United States. And it's absolutely true that if you look at the smaller countries, again, the emerging markets, the developing economies, that's really a different matter. That's really where it is something of an alternative to the dollar because it's digital. It's, you can use paper dollars, but they're not doing the same things. But I think China and Russia are going to look for something. I'm not sure it's going to be on a public blockchain. I suspect it'll be centrally controlled. But the move that the U.S. did of shutting down the reserves or blocking the reserves of the Russian central bank, absolutely historic, and will probably accelerate moves in the international financial system, but they're not going to take place at warp speed. Something that would have taken 50 years, maybe is going to take 20 years.
Ken, we only have about 30 seconds left, but just quickly, do you still believe Bitcoin is a bubble that inevitably will pop?
Well, I've never used the word bubble. I think it needs to be regulated in the advanced economies. I don't think it'll be regulated everywhere. And when it is, I suspect it might be worth a lot less than today, but I don't expect it to see it disappear, but I expect to see other things replace it. MySpace becomes Facebook.